I stood at the gate of Fort Calloway at 6 in the morning, my breath fogging in the cold, my ID already out because I'd learned a long time ago not to make anyone wait on me. The guard, young, maybe 22, crisp uniform, nameplate reading PFC Ortiz, took one look at me before he even glanced at the card and said, "You don't look like an officer." I didn't flinch. I've heard versions of that sentence my whole career, in different uniforms, different decades, different faces saying it to me like they were the first ones clever enough to notice. I handed him my ID anyway, because arguing with a 22-year-old at a gate has never once been a good use of my time. He looked at it once. Then he looked at it again, slower. Then the color just left his face, like someone had pulled a plug somewhere behind his eyes. He didn't say anything else. He turned, walked briskly back into the guard shack, and I watched him pick up the phone with a hand that wasn't quite steady. 3 minutes later, a man came jogging out of the administration building without his jacket buttoned, and he said the sentence that, if I'm honest, still lives somewhere warm in my chest. "General, we didn't know you were coming." I told him it was fine, that I liked arriving unannounced, that surprise inspections were the only honest ones. But driving onto that base, past the young man who was still standing rigid by the gate like he was bracing for a reprimand that was never going to come, I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. Because it wasn't really about a gate or a guard or a morning in October. It was about every room I'd ever walked into where somebody decided, before I opened my mouth, that I didn't belong at the head of the table. And one room in particular 4 years earlier, where the person who taught me to believe that about myself wasn't a stranger at a checkpoint, it was my own mother. To understand how it came to this, I have to take you back to the year everything nearly ended before it started. My name is Elena Marquez. 4 years before that morning at the gate, I was a lieutenant colonel, halfway through the hardest command tour of my career, running logistics and intelligence coordination for a joint task force that most of my extended family couldn't have located on a map. My mother, Rosa, is a woman who raised 3 kids on a schoolteacher's salary after my father left, and I want to be clear that I loved her deeply the whole time this was happening. Love and damage aren't opposites, they just sit in the same house sometimes. Rosa never understood my career. Not in the way you don't understand astrophysics, which is fine, but in the way you refuse to update a picture in your head even when the evidence walks in the door wearing rank insignia. To her, I was still the daughter who cried during thunderstorms, who couldn't parallel park until I was 26, who once got lost in our own neighborhood. She decided somewhere along the way that the woman in the uniform was a costume I was playing dress up in, and that underneath it I was still fragile, still failing, still needed managing. My younger brother, Dimitri, was the person I actually trusted, though even he spent a lot of that year sitting on a fence he'd built himself. Dimitri worked as a contractor, self-employed, the kind of guy who kept the peace at every family function by simply agreeing with whoever spoke last. He wasn't malicious. He was just conflict-averse in a way that meant, more often than not, he let our mother's version of events stand unchallenged because challenging her cost more than he wanted to pay. I don't blame him for that anymore. I did for a while. Here's the part that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it too long. That year I was under real pressure at work, a joint operation, multinational partners, a leadership transition happening 2 ranks above me, everything riding on precision and trust. And my mother, without telling me, called my command's public affairs liaison. She'd found the number online, introduced herself as my next of kin, and told a full-bird colonel on my chain of command that she was worried about me, that I'd been acting erratic, that she thought the stress of the job was making me unstable, that maybe someone should look into whether I was fit for what I'd been given. She said this because 2 weeks earlier I'd had a hard, honest phone call with her about boundaries, about how she couldn't keep showing up unannounced at events on base, about how I needed her to trust that I knew what I was doing. She heard a boundary and translated it, in her mind, into evidence of a breakdown. She weaponized her own fear and mailed it directly to the people who controlled my career. I didn't find out for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of noticing my commander was suddenly, subtly, watching me differently, extra questions in briefings, a request for a wellness check-in I hadn't asked for, a strange hesitation before he'd hand me anything sensitive. I thought it was me. I started rereading my own emails for tone. I started wondering if I actually was as steady as I believed, which is its own particular kind of theft. When someone makes you doubt the one thing you built your entire adult life on being sure of. I only learned the truth because a friend in personnel, someone who owed me a favor from years back, quietly told me there was a note in an informal file with my mother's name on it. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot after that conversation, not crying, just very still. Cataloging. That's the word for what I did instead of falling apart. I started cataloging. While all of this sat like a stone in my chest, the actual work never stopped, and maybe that's the part people don't understand about competence under pressure. It doesn't wait for your personal life to be tidy before it demands your best. That same month I ran point on a coordination exercise between 4 allied commands, synced across 3 time zones, that came back with a performance review calling it one of the cleanest joint operations the task force had run in 2 years. I briefed a 2-star general on contingency planning and didn't stumble once, even with a knot sitting under my ribs the whole time about what my own mother thought of me. There's a particular loneliness in being trusted completely by the people who've actually seen your work, while being quietly doubted by the person who's supposed to know you best. I went home most nights and didn't tell anyone what was happening, because saying it out loud felt like giving it more room to breathe than it deserved. Dimitri called me around then, technically checking in, but I could hear our mother's fingerprints all over the questions. "Mom just wants to make sure you're okay," he said, in that careful voice he used when he was relaying something he didn't fully agree with but wasn't willing to argue against either. "She says you sounded really off on the phone." I asked him directly if he thought I sounded off. There was a pause, not a long one but long enough that I heard it, before he said, I don't know, N. Maybe you have been under a lot of stress. That maybe did something to me. It wasn't betrayal exactly. It was worse in a smaller way. It was the sound of someone I loved choosing the path of least resistance over the truth he could plainly see if he'd just looked. I could have called my mother right then and had it out with her. Some part of me wanted to lay every phone log and every consequence at her feet and make her sit in it. But I'd learned something in this job that applies far beyond it. You don't win an argument with someone who isn't arguing in good faith. You don't get handed the truth by someone who's decided the story is more comfortable than the facts. Arguing would have made it about my tone, my defensiveness, my reaction. She would have found a way to make my anger the evidence of the very instability she'd invented. So I made a different decision. I decided I wasn't going to defend myself out loud anymore. I was going to let the record speak whenever it finally got the chance to. That decision didn't come from peace. It came from something closer to strategy, and I want to be honest about that because I think people romanticize taking the high road as some serene, generous thing, and for me it was closer to armor. I started keeping everything. Every email, every timestamp log from that 6-week window. The informal personnel note itself once my friend forwarded it to me with her name blacked out for protection. Phone records showing exactly when my mother's calls to the liaison office had gone out. I wasn't building a legal case. I was building a timeline, dates, geostamps from my deployment schedule, records that proved, with total indifference to anyone's feelings, exactly where I was and what I was doing during every single hour my mother had described as erratic. I didn't tell Dimitri what I was doing. I didn't tell anyone except that one friend in personnel, who I swore to secrecy, half out of protectiveness and half, I think, because saying it out loud to more people would have made it feel more real than I could afford yet. My mother, of course, kept talking. That's the thing about people who've decided on a narrative, they don't stop repeating it just because you've gone quiet. She told my aunt I was burning out. She told a family friend she was worried about my judgment. Every version got a little more dramatic, a little more certain, like she was rehearsing for something. And every time it circled back to me through the family grapevine, I said nothing, logged the date it happened, and went back to work. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. What I didn't know yet was that the moment was going to arrive on its own, in front of everyone, at my grandmother's 91st birthday dinner that December. And that when it did, there'd be no controlling how it landed. The dinner was at my aunt's house, that particular chaos of too many folding chairs and someone's kids running underfoot, and my grandmother, small and sharp-eyed at the head of the table, pretending she couldn't hear half of what was being said around her, which was always a lie. My mother was in fine form that night, holding court the way she does, and about 40 minutes in, over the second round of plates, she brought it up again, casually, like she was just making conversation, the way you'd mention the weather. She told my aunt, in front of at least 6 people including Dimitri and my grandmother, that she'd had to step in with my command that year because I'd been falling apart and nobody up there was paying attention. She said it with this little sigh, this practiced sadness, like she was a woman who'd been carrying a heavy burden nobly and alone. Something in me went very still and very clear, the way it does right before a briefing when all the noise drops away and you can suddenly see the whole shape of the thing at once. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even set down my fork right away. I just said, "Which 6 weeks, Mom?" She blinked, thrown by the specificity, and said something vague about that whole stretch in the spring. I asked her, still calm, still quiet, to give me the actual dates, because I happened to have them written down. She laughed, a little uneasily now, and said she didn't keep a calendar of when she worried about her own daughter. I told her that was fine, I did. I pulled out my phone and read the dates out loud, the exact 6 weeks, followed by what I'd actually been doing on the specific days she'd told the liaison office I was unstable, coordinating a 4-nation logistics exercise, briefing a 2-star general, receiving a written commendation for the clarity of my incident reporting. I read the date of her first call to the liaison office. I read the internal note, the one with my friend's name redacted, that quoted her own words back to her, "Erratic, unfit, someone should look into it," in front of my aunt, my grandmother, and my brother. The table went silent in that specific way that isn't peaceful. It's just everyone realizing at once that the floor has shifted and nobody's sure yet which way it's going to tilt. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Didn't look angry. It looked caught. "You went over my head," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than anyone else at that table. Not to help me. To convince the people I answered to that I couldn't be trusted. While I was doing the best work of my career. I watched Dimitri's face change in real time, that careful, fence-sitting expression cracking into something raw, something like shame, like he was doing his own quiet math about every "maybe you have been under a lot of stress" he'd fed me that year. He looked at our mother, then at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't say maybe. He said, quietly but clearly enough for the table to hear, "Mom, that's not okay." She told me the dates too back then and I didn't check. My mother started to say something about how she was just scared, just a mother worried about her daughter, and maybe that was even true underneath it all, but fear doesn't get to rewrite what it does once it's out in the world doing damage. The timeline didn't care about her intentions. It only cared about what actually happened in order on the record. And for the first time in that whole ugly year, the record was the one doing the talking, and it wasn't on her side. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I finished my plate, helped my grandmother with her coat when the night wound down, and drove home in a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in months. Not triumph exactly, more like the specific relief of finally putting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. The 4 years between that dinner and the morning at the gate changed the shape of my whole life, and mostly for the better, even though I wouldn't have chosen the road that got me there. My career kept climbing on its own terms, 2 more assignments, a promotion I earned in rooms my mother never once witnessed, and eventually the stars that had a 22-year-old guard turning pale at a checkpoint because reality hadn't caught up to what I'd become. Dimitri and I are close now, genuinely, in a way we weren't before that dinner. He calls just to talk, not to relay anyone else's worry, and he's told me more than once that watching that timeline unfold in front of him was the moment he stopped being neutral about anything that mattered. My mother reached out about a year after the dinner, tentative, an email instead of a call, saying she'd been thinking about things and hoped we could move forward. I wrote back. I told her I loved her, and that I was glad she was reflecting, and that I was open to a relationship with her built on honesty going forward, but that it would have boundaries now, real ones, the kind she couldn't call over my head to get around. I didn't ask her to apologize on a schedule I set. I didn't need a ceremony. I just needed her to understand that the version of me she'd once described to a stranger on the phone didn't exist, had never existed, and that the woman standing at that gate 4 years later, steady, trusted, unmistakably in command, was the only version left standing. So when people ask me what I learned from that whole ugly stretch, I don't tell them a story about revenge because it was never that. I tell them that the truth doesn't need you to defend it loudly. It just needs you to survive long enough, and keep good enough records, for it to finally get its turn to speak. If you've ever had someone rewrite you into a smaller, weaker story than the one you were actually living, hang on, sometimes the timeline just needs time. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.